Sometimes you're just ready for change in your life. With the spring coming and about 5 years at my current job, it was time for me to move on to something else and take a little time for myself in between. I recently took a new job with a slightly delayed start date, and so I found myself with 3 weeks in between to do whatever I want. Naturally, the first thing that sprang to my mind in this scenario was to go on a road trip. So I laid plans to head south again since the weather was still intermittently chilly here in DC. This time, the final goal was Savannah. I've been there before as a kid, and I really liked the city's old world charm, and frankly, I just needed a destination for the sake of it. A few maintenance items were coming due on my bike in the near future, so before I headed anywhere, I knocked a few tasks off the checklist to make sure the bike ran well. I adjusted the valves, changed the oil, made sure the timing was accurate, etc., etc. Of course, the day I decided to set off, it was pissing rain and chilly. Not too cold, but still not pleasant riding weather at all. But with my rain gear on and a few layers, I wasn't really cold, and it was really only my hands that were a little wet. Gore-Tex Infinium is water resistant, sadly not waterproof. By the time I got to Richmond to stop for lunch, though, the sun was out and it was in the 80s. I was peeling layers off bit by bit after grabbing a sandwich at a local food truck that seemed to have set up in the awning of what used to be a car wash. They also had a motorcycle helmet on top of an old signpost, like a head on a pike. I don't really know what that was about. Back on the road, the target was just to get to North Carolina. I had hammered it down the interstate to get to Richmond, but from there to my next stop, I stuck to the back roads and the state highways. Slower, more ponderous ways to get places, but mostly free of wind buffeting from trucks and speeding cars, and usually the scenery's nicer anyways. Before I got to my campsite, I wanted to make a stop. A real Americana roadside attraction kind of stop. Now, I like conspiracy theories. Not as a believer, but someone who kind of appreciates them as essentially a folklore tradition. So, naturally, I had to make a stop in Littleton, North Carolina at the Cryptozoology and Paranormal Museum, a homey little museum about all manner of the otherworldly and unusual. The guy who runs the place, Stephen Barcelo, is a charming enough guy, if a little overenthusiastic. Among the installations of Bigfoot and swamp creature and other weird cryptids, he told me how he used to be a journalist in New York who moved down to Littleton to get away from the big city.
Well, I used to be a journalist in New York Daily News. I was escaping New York high taxes and tolls. Somehow found Littleton, North Carolina. I was looking all over. And after that, next thing I know, the Bigfoot sightings start coming in. People going, so-and-so saw it. Actually, they were calling it Wolfman. These older people in town, I would say, I saw this Wolfman. I go, Wolfman? And you talk to him, it was a bipedal, hairy creature. It was sort of like a Bigfoot. What's a Bigfoot? They didn't know. And so they were referring to like Lon Chaney movies and stuff they saw as younger folks.
According to Barcelo's telling, he then set about doing this gumshoe reporting to collect people's stories. Having recently bought a house in the area, he and his wife turned their front room into a museum. And over time it grew, and they recently ended up moving to a new building, which was the one that I saw. The place has everything from the imposing Bigfoot statue at the front to very realistic-looking plaster casts of Bigfoot prints to dolls in boxes that supposedly move and other cursed objects. I couldn't really tell how much of this was the result of the guy being thoroughly and sincerely pilled and how much of it was just him being a showman kind of out to get people to spend the $5 to come to his museum. Outlining the time that he spent involved in local government, too, there's also a possibility that he was just trying to get people to come visit the town as well. What mixture of these motivations actually fuels the place, I can't really say, but it's definitely an amusing roadside stop. After packing up and leaving the museum, I stopped by a Piggly Wiggly to grab some food for the evening, and then headed on to Carroll Lake for the night to stay. The lake itself is really lovely. It straddles the Virginia-North Carolina border. I got my stuff unpacked and set up my tent and just went down to sit on my camp chair and have a beer down by the water, listening to the waves lapping on the shore. In the morning, I packed up the bike, but it decided that it was not going to go anywhere. It turned over just fine, but it would not light. After checking some of the basics, I suspected the spark plug wire on one side was giving up the ghost on me, so I swapped the plug leads to see if that was the issue, because I have two 6-volt coils on my setup, and it was. Figuring that it was an issue of water getting under the cap and into contact with the connection underneath, I got the condensation dried off enough to light the bike, and wrapped up the plug head with some electrician's tape, and then headed off. There was a lot of rain throughout the day, and with my plug wires in the condition that they were in, it made for a frustrating day of riding. I had hoped that my electric tape protection job would keep the water out, but during a heavy downpour, the bike sputtered and then just died on me, and I ended up rolling into someone's driveway. This was a real low point. I was standing at the end of this person's driveway, bike dead, in the middle of a thunderstorm. Not great. I did eventually get it going again, just long enough to get me down the road about a quarter of a mile to the awning of a church, which kind of let me dry off for a bit and get the bike going again once the weather had passed. After the rain had passed, and with the help of some WD-40 to keep some of the water out of my plug caps, I finished up the rest of the day's ride through the swampy southeast corner of North Carolina and arrived at my campsite for the night on the shores of Lake Waccamaw. With more rain again overnight, the bike again did not want to start in the morning. I fiddled with the leads a bit, trying to dry them out and get a good connection, and then eventually once I got it going, I headed out. Definitely not an encouraging sign to have the thing causing me so much trouble each morning so far. I checked the map to see if there were any motorcycle shops nearby that would be open on a Sunday, and I did see one, so Between myself and there, though, was someplace I did want to stop, the Green Swamp Preserve. The swamp in particular is one I had wanted to visit because it's one of the very few native homes to a particularly fun plant, the Venus flytrap. You'd really think that they were tropical, given their kind of otherworldly presentation, but they're native to this corner of North Carolina. The preserve is also home to a bunch of other insectivorous plants, including several kinds of pitcher plants. Despite the name of the preserve, Venus flytraps don't actually grow in the swamp, though. They grow in a longleaf pine savanna. The area is filled with these tall pine trees, and the area underneath is covered in a low plant cover. So close to the ground, here is where the flytraps are. There was recently a controlled burn, which is part of the management process to keep these plants alive, so the traps, when I found them, were pretty small, but I did find some. After that, I went just a bit down the road to a nearby town that had the motorcycle dealership I'd seen to see if they maybe had some spark plug wires I could use. They didn't really have anything on hand that would actually fit the coil end of my bike, unfortunately, so they didn't really have anything I could replace it with, but one of the guys at the parts counter, Jeff, he did clean up my wires with some contact cleaner for me and flushed out some of the gunk that was in there, as the spark plug connection end was actually a bit rusty. So hopefully this would help me a little bit. They didn't ask anything for it, so I ended up buying some tickets to a charity raffle that they were doing. The prizes for this were either a 50cc dirt bike or a clock, so definitely in the South now. The bike started up just fine after that, and I was on my way again. So from there, I headed to Beaufort, South Carolina, where I stayed at a hotel for the night as a treat. The weather was warm, and it seemed like the rain was gone for the rest of the day, which was a real blessing after getting repeatedly soaked. In the morning, I went for a run through downtown Beaufort, got a shower, got the bike packed up, and moving again, and plugged Hilton Head into Google Maps. After a warm ride, I stopped at a tiki bar on the beach, had a beer and some lunch. Just kind of seemed like the right thing to do in the area. From there, I headed into Savannah itself. Rode along brick streets underneath the awning with these trees covered in Spanish moss, and then stopped at a coffee shop for an afternoon pick-me-up. I walked around Oglethorpe Square for a little bit, and then popped over to the Colonial Park Cemetery, which has a few different interesting people in it, including Archibald Bullock, who was the first president of Georgia, some people from the Revolutionary era, and then Edward Green Malbone, who was apparently a famed maker of miniatures back in his day, and there was also a grave for an unknown duelist who lost. I would have liked to spend a little more time poking around the city, but the skies were darkening and there were reports of a severe thunderstorm system on the way, so I decided to head out toward my campsite for the night on a local farm. I very nearly made it. About 15 minutes short of the farm, the storm arrived, so I pulled off the road and hauled my bike up underneath the awning of an American Red Cross building to let the weather pass. It was actually pretty nice just to be able to relax for a bit and listen to the rain pattering on the roof and hearing the thunder go by. Once the weather had passed and the rain had mostly abated, I picked up my chair, rode onto the farm, and set up my stuff for the evening amid the damp pines.
Hey, bub. Hi, buddy. Don't wanna run you over.
The next morning, hopes for the bike to be running properly were dashed yet again. The bike was hard starting, and upon inspection, one plug lead was again covered in gunk. So I got some contact cleaner out from the farmhands and got the bike running down to a local gas station where I got some breakfast. After I came back out though, the bike just would not start. The wire had really just given up the ghost on me at this stage. It was clear that all the little fixes I had taken up till now just weren't going to cut it anymore. So I ended up taking all the stuff off my bike so I could troubleshoot. Various fiddling and tinkering, it just wasn't cutting it anymore. This plug wire had really died on me. A little unsure of the best way to get myself out of the situation, I called the guys at Boxerworks in Athens, Georgia, which is where I was trying to get to for the day, some 3 hours away. Nathan, on the phone, gave me advice on cutting back the wire and just wrapping the head of it around the spark plug. Alright, so after an epic struggle, I now have a very non-OSHA compliant setup here, where I just stripped back the wire, wrapped it around the spark plug, screwed the spark plug cap back on, and hopefully this will get me to Athens. Fingers crossed.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Absolutely not OSHA compliant. Finally moving again! Thank God!
Definitely not a very safe arrangement, as the hot end of the plug was more or less completely exposed, even with part of the rubber boot put back on top of it, but that got me to Athens, and the guys let me pull my bike into the shop and replace both of my leads.
It's me!
So all you have is these regular, we don't even have resistor ends on here.
That's what I wondered when because I took it all apart
These are Sparkies.
and it was just like a piece of metal, and I was like, oh.
That's pushed in on a 90-degree angle.
I also got a shirt, which when I tried to pay for it, Nathan told me to consider it a gift and give him $20 for parts and labor. Absolute kings, those guys. If you're on an Airhead anywhere in the South, definitely they're the shop for you. They're great folks. Nathan even had a quick look at my carbs to make sure that they were adjusted right. He said they were pretty close, which felt good. And he told me that part of the noise that I'm getting from the front end of my bike at idle is probably the timing chain starting to get a little loose, so might be time to replace that here soon too. With fresh plug leads and the bike running smoothly again, I continued on to Atlanta, where I stayed at a little hotel. I met up with a friend of mine from college for a beer at New Realm Brewery just up the way. It was windy but warm enough evening, and lots of people were out on the trail next to the brewery, so an evening in civilization was nice after camping for a few days. The next morning, I grabbed some coffee and headed out of Atlanta towards Charlotte, North Carolina. I have some family there that I wanted to visit, so I enjoyed the meandering back roads. I stopped again in Athens for lunch at a little place called Marty's at midday, which was really wonderful. Had a nice sandwich and a cup of gumbo. Honestly, some of the best food I think I had on the trip. From there, I spent the evening in Charlotte with some family and caught up with them before heading out the next morning. I set out in the morning from Charlotte, and after grabbing some breakfast at a local place, I took again to the back roads out of town and headed to my next campsite for the night in Twin Lakes State Park in Virginia. On the way, though, through the top end of North Carolina, I saw a sign on the side of the road for a Pickers Festival. I didn't really have the greatest idea of what the hell that meant, but I was ready for a break regardless, so I pulled off the main road and followed the signs of the festival. Parking my bike in a grassy parking lot, I then went through the gate to see what was going on. Set up across the entirety of a fairground, complete with a little railway that ran in a circle, were dozens and dozens of vendors selling pretty much everything imaginable under the sun. Some of them sold old toys, others were selling old refurbished bicycles, old signage, motorcycles, you name it, it was there somewhere. This was basically a garage sale on steroids. People were bartering and traded stuff, and there were food vendors hawking snacks and drinks amid all this chaos. Back on the road, it was time to make up some ground into Virginia. As the day waned, it got colder, and my heated vest really saved my ass here. My hands were definitely cold by the time that I got in, but the vest at least kept my core warm enough and kept that real, true feeling of bone cold away. When I rolled into my campsite, I kind of realized that this was really more of a place that catered to RVs than to tent campers. Most of the area was gravel, and frankly, there wasn't much in terms of scenery to look at either, though it was nice to have clean facilities to use. Mostly undeterred, I set up my stuff, had some ramen for dinner, and relaxed under the trees and watched the stars slowly come out. In the morning, I packed up my stuff for the night before and made the last stretch back home. Despite the mild chill, I decided that since I wasn't that far from home, I may as well make the last section of the trip worthwhile. A lot of the roads I've been riding on for this trip hadn't been particularly twisty, which is fine for getting from place to place, but frankly it isn't as much fun on a bike. So for the last bit, I went a bit out of my way to go up through Charlottesville and hop onto Skyline Drive for that last stretch home. I realized that I didn't have enough gas right before I got on, so I had to go back down the mountain to fill up and then head back up. But back on the ridgeline, I paid my entrance fee and set off down the curvy blacktop.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Frankly, Skyline Drive is the worst part of the Blue Ridge Parkway. You have to pay for it and the speed limits are lower, but even so, it's a wonderful piece of road for bikes. There's basically never more than a quarter mile of straight road at any given point, and the road is clean pretty much everywhere. It was cold up in the mountains though, and the trees were still bare even at the end of March, but the views were still great and the twisties were fun. After getting off Skyline Drive, it was time to head back down to lower ground and make up the last hour or so of riding to get back. As I rode through the chilly spring air, it was perhaps missing the warm air and Spanish moss-covered trees of Georgia and South Carolina, but I was still pretty ready to be home. A week on the road is a good stretch. It's long enough to get you away from your usual routines and get you out in the world to see some new things and meet some new people, but by the end, I'm ready to sleep in my own bed again. After all the trouble I had with the bike as well, it felt good to have actually managed to get through the whole trip. Despite its age, the bike had gotten me where I wanted to go and gotten me all the way back, even if there were some issues in between. Being stranded at one stage does make the return home all the sweeter, but that's all part of the adventure,